I have opinions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I just found myself having opinions. Because we discussed this earlier, and I think Denmark and Sweden have a lot of things in common. One of them being that we are under constant influx under Anglophone culture, as in specifically from the US and from England. And a problem I see when I look at Swedish science fiction is that instead of digging where we stand, looking for our own cultural roots, a lot of Swedish science fiction I've seen now and also back in time is very, very obviously modelled on Anglophone science fiction. And what we end up with is that we end up with a carbon copy of a culture that we don't actually have any contact with. So it becomes it becomes very shallow, at least when you do it this way. You model it on a culture that you don't have any actual background in, and
It's not connected to you.
it's not actually connected to you. And this is a huge problem, and I think one of the biggest parts of this problem is that we are not quite aware of this, because it's a benign form of colonization. It sneaks in, and we learn that our own cultures are not as cool. They're kind of inferior, whilst the Anglophone science fiction is so much cooler. We learn that the English language has more weight. It's culturally superior, which is why a lot of Swedes, I'm sure a lot of Danes as well, you know, writes lyrics in English, or you start writing fiction in English without actually establishing your own voice in your native tongue first. And this is a problem I see when I teach creative writing, specifically writing science fiction and fantasy. And I get a lot of students who, without actually having found their own voice in Swedish, are trying to write in English. And when they do so, they model a stereotypical idea of Anglophone science fiction and fantasy that they have in the roots. So I think we need to be aware of what's going on.
Well, basically the same thing is happening in Denmark, but I see it from a different point or angle, because I've often heard Danish fans saying, we're not going to read science fiction in Danish because it sucks. We're going to read English science fiction. And I find that, well, incredibly strange, because, and a bit, sorry for using the word, a bit dense. Come on, people. You can't just say everything is bad because it is written in your mother tongue. The second thing, I don't teach creative writing, but I teach normal school. And a lot of my students try to be creative in English, and basically they're not good at it. But when I ask them, why don't you try to be creative in Danish? And they say, because English, well, I'm much more confident in English. It sounds better. And I find that harsh, and I find that quite negative, because in the end, Danish will end up being, well, a second-class language, I guess. Which of course is very, very sad. But as, what can I say, a statement here would be that I try to force Danish on them. It does not work. They rebel, and they plainly just sit back and stare at me like I'm some sort of fossil from the last century, as if that benign form of colonization is actually correct. It is actually bad that we try to still keep our original culture. Actually, sitting there for 10 years, was it? Yeah. Had a yearly competition where you could send in a story that had to be rooted in Danish culture somehow. Different, like the Danes and
Time Machine.
Time Machine, the Danes and the future of travel. So we try to incorporate Danes in the story, and actually I thought that worked quite well. So make sure that these stories take place in Denmark, and they cannot take place anywhere else.
I'm going to ask a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, but I was wondering, because when I started writing from the perspective of my own culture, I was wondering how much of Danish mythology, of Danish the stuff that really belongs to Denmark is being mined, or how much of the stuff that's belonging really to Scandinavian countries is being mined when writers write their stories. Because I think this is very relevant to how you can break the stereotype way that people look at the genre itself.
I don't know if we actually mine our culture, but we do have a big culture when it comes to writing. Because we have a lot of quite influential people. Of course, H.C. Anderson, but also as I watched the British series Penny. What's it called?
Penny Dreadful.
Sorry.
Penny Dreadful.
Yeah. Well, and actually, one of the episodes, one of the Englishmen scoffed because they were no longer playing Shakespeare; they were playing Ibsen. It was very bad. So I don't think we actually consciously mine it, but subconsciously or unconsciously we might do, because we are taught a lot of Danish culture in school. We actually have from the Ministry of Education a complete list of Danish authors that everybody should know and must know. And actually, if you do not know these people, if you're very strict, you're not allowed to continue through the school system. Actually, that's true. Of course, no one enforces it, but that is the rule. So I think subconsciously we mine a lot, but consciously I don't think we do.
Well, in Sweden there's a huge urban fantasy renaissance and folklore fantasy renaissance, which is really encouraging to see. So we have lots of new urban fantasy writers who are really mining into Swedish folklore, and also some modern, more epic fantasy that also connects to the Swedish mythos. So fantasy is definitely doing really well, and it looks, it seems to be. I can't see that it's gonna get any worse. It's only going to get better. There's also a rise in steampunk. Although I don't know how much this connects to Swedish folklore or Swedish culture, because I haven't read about it yet. But I will. As for science fiction, it's still fairly traditional. I think in the sense that science fiction connects to the Swedish culture is that it connects to the proletarian literature of the turn of the century and forward. So, like we talked about before, is that Swedish literature has a very solid foundation in proletarian literature, and a lot of science fiction, especially when it comes to dystopian literature, connects straight back to that genre.
Well, I think when you say that you have proletarian literature in Sweden, I think if I should have a common denominator for Danish science fiction, apart from Lars's, of course, I think that is we try to visualize normal everyday life. It might be what you call proletarian.
Social realism.
Social realism. Yeah. We normally take a setting that is, of course, put in the future, but actually has something to do with the life we have today. And same situations, same problems. I think there is a threat of the world might change, but human nature will never change.
It sounds about the same.
Yeah.
Is everyone also really sad most of the time?
Not necessarily, but they tend to be a bit whiny.
Yeah. Human brain likes to compartmentalize things. That's how we've survived through history, and we probably wouldn't have if we weren't very good at dividing things into groups. That's poisonous, that's good to eat, that person's friendly, that person's not. And this is where stereotypes come from. We do this automatically, and unless we're aware of it, we're going to continue to do it. And since our reptile brain tells us that this is the perfectly logical things to do, it can be very hard to stop using stereotypes because it feels right. Which is why when you write someone from a group that you yourself don't belong to, unless you check yourself, you're going to use a stereotype. You're going to use the attributes that your culture has told you belongs to that particular person. So a man, for example, he never cries. Well, if he cries one single tear. He doesn't talk about his feelings, he is unable to care for children, he is violent, he is a potential rapist, He wields weapons with ease. He's not afraid of anything. He walks away from explosions. So unless you actually talk to real men who read about different types of men, now obviously this is not really a problem in culture, but you're going to end up with stereotypes. So the only real medicine for avoiding stereotypes is to do research and to actually talk to people who belong to the group that you are trying to characterize.
Yeah, well, the author of Game of Thrones, he was once a person said to him, "You write women is exceptionally wrong." And then he said, "Well, yeah, I begin by seeing them as people."
Yeah.
And actually, I think, of course, we need to understand the cultures we write. But I also think that to have the starting point that you actually say that we are all human, we share some common ground here. I think that is just as vital a fact. That perhaps contrary we might act differently on rejection, but I guess the feeling is basically, on most of the time, the same. So therefore, I don't think we should research every single character. The key ones, yes, but the remainder, no. Because otherwise, I think the plot subsides into obscurity, and instead it's all about the people. It isn't necessarily. I often see science fiction, fantasy, horror, even realism is not really about the people, but about something else.
How can you detach the plot from people?
Because I sometimes think that people are just basic cardboard cutouts compared to the ideas.
Okay, but what you end up with is tossing people in the background and not actually developing them. What you risk ending up with are those stereotypes.
I don't see that as stereotypes at all, because they are cardboard. They are not vital in this story, for example, to what happens. The vital thing is the idea, not the persons acting out the idea.
How do you then develop fully formed characters?
Sorry?
How do you develop a fully formed story, a story that's rich and full, if your characters aren't fully developed?
Because
I don't think it's necessary, as I said, to put the entire background story of the character. But for the writer themselves, for instance, it's quite possible that you have a city filled with robots, but in your head, when you look at them, you see them as individual beings. So when they land on the page, they are already carrying the weight of this history that you've built for them on the page, in your head. So but you don't need to write everything about them.
Well, I don't see every single story as character-driven. Sometimes I see them as environment-driven or idea-driven, where basically, as I said, the characters are enacting a play or being cardboard. The idea is the vital part of it. And of course, at other times, it is character-driven. It is very much necessary for the characters to be there, to be full, to develop a realistic and believable story.
I still fail to see why a story with developed characters would be characterized as only character-driven. You can have a story with a full plot and full characters at the same time.
Of course, I use this division to try to make it apparent, but okay. Let's see. If I have a story that is basically about the concept of time, not about people in time, but the idea of time. The people might just be enacting ideas out or sentences out that in whole makes a mosaic picture of what time is. But they themselves, what they feel, who they are, where they come from, is not important. The idea of time is.
Even in the instance that one uses cardboard cutouts as a vehicle for the story, even writers who do that will also have to think about how well those cardboard cutouts mirrors the real world. There's a very common problem that most of these cardboard cutouts will be white men, for example.
Yeah.
Which does not mirror the world as it looks. So maybe that's what we should look at instead. But what I was going to say about how to try to fix this thing about stereotypes is one of the problems we have is that many people who don't belong to a minority group live in a sort of echo chamber. We read only fiction that is about ourselves. A lot of the time when you see people recommending works, for example, recommending science fiction or fantasy works, most of the time when that happens, there will be a long row of science fiction or fantasy written by American and British white men. And Ursula Le Guin, that someone else. And this is not me exaggerating, I shit you not. I have seen so many instances when this happened. It's a best of list, it's in discussions on Facebook. And people repeat these same authors over and over and over again, and this is why these stereotypes keep perpetuating themselves, because people read a certain set of characters. Men read about female characters a lot less expensively than female readers read about male characters. This is statistics. This is very well known, and this is often this is a big reason why a lot of male writers say it's difficult to write female characters. While I've never ever heard a female writer saying it's difficult to write male characters, because we have to read about them all the time. Mm-hmm. And this is also a reason why white writers say that it can be very difficult to write about persons of color. Because very often they don't read from that person's perspective. I mean, if everyone in here think about the last time they read something written by a person of color, when was that? Or a person who's queer in some way, for that matter, who wrote about that. It's kind of embarrassing.